Hey gang, what's up? Welcome back to today's edition of Intuitive Angling. Really appreciate you guys making some time to spend with me today and watch the video. Always very grateful for that. And guys, today we're sort of going to give you guys an in-depth tutorial on using fluorocarbon fishing line. Now, we talked about this before on the channel quite a bit, but I want to dive a little bit deeper in today's video. And I really want to talk about some things regarding performance, how you can get better performance out of your line, some tips and advice. Talk a little bit about some myths and misconceptions of the product. So we're going to get into that in today's video. Now, if you guys haven't seen it as far as the progression of fluorocarbon line, go back a little bit. You know, when bass fishing first started, like, back in the 20s and 30s and all the way up until like the, early 60s, that Dacron line, that white thick Dacron line was what most people used to bass fish with. And then monofilament came about in the 50s and 60s. Monofilament was the staple in bass fishing all the way from the early 60s up until the mid 90s. And then during the mid 90s, you started seeing an evolution in the technology of braided line. Braided line became a little bit more invisible. They had different colors. They had smaller diameters. It was more suited for bass fishing. And then fluorocarbon lines like the Seaguar here came about on strong towards the late 90s. And ever since then, people have pretty much gone to fluorocarbon line for most bass fishing situations, except for certain situations where other type of lines are better. So, like for example, when you're fishing a topwater line, a topwater bait, you want to use monofilament because it floats more than fluorocarbon, doesn't sink your topwater down. And obviously, there's situations where you don't want to use braid because of the visibility factor of braid. Now, the main characteristics of a fluorocarbon line are the fact it's smaller diameter and it's invisible in the water, and it's got lower stretch than mono. That's the three characteristics that make it stand out above monofilament and above braid. So what this does is you can use a lighter line, or you can use smaller diameter of the fluorocarbon, and you can still accomplish the same thing as you would with a larger diameter of monofilament with that. So in essence, what that allows you to do is you can, for example, you can fish a crankbait and you can get the same power out of a certain pound test, but you can get the bait deeper because it's got a smaller diameter. And also the way that the light reflects and refracts off a fluorocarbon line, practically invisible in the water. And everybody knows that has used monofilament line, that mono is super stretchy, and fluorocarbon line has probably 75% less stretch than mono, although it does have some stretch, a lot more than braid, obviously, that has zero. But all those factors add up to some positive situations for most fishing conditions. Now, what I want to do in today's video, guys, I want to give you guys some tips and advice on how to get and how to maximize your use of fluorocarbon. So the first thing about it, when you're talking about fluorocarbon line, let's talk about how to, get the most life out of it, when you need to replace it and how to properly spool it. The main thing about fluorocarbon line that you're going to have to remember is that when you spool the line up on your reels, this is a big problem a lot of people have. It doesn't matter if you're using a bait cast reel or a spinning reel. Make sure that you don't fill the reel completely full to the top of it. Leave like a little 1/16 of an inch gap between the outside part of the spool. If you fill it up a little bit too full, it tends to give you more bird's nest, especially on a spinning outfit. You just get better performance if you leave a little bit of a gap in there. And also, when you spool your line, make sure that the line comes off of the reels of the line spool the same way it's going on your reel. So if you're using a spinning outfit, make sure that it's coming off the same way onto the spool. Same with the bait caster, make sure you lay it that it goes on the same way. This will allow you again to reduce the amount of fluffs and bird's nests in the line that you use. And also when you're spooling your line, make sure that you have a lot of tension on the line. And I like to wet my line. One of my favorite ways to put fluorocarbon line on, there's two different ways. I'll take like a little trash can, put water in it, and then just put my line in there and reel it up like that. Or I'll take like a wet rag and let it come through my fingers. It just seems like it seats it down on the reel better, and you don't have the problem with the bird's nest. That's a big issue. A lot of people say about using fluorocarbon line, especially on a spinning outfit, is they get fluffs and bird's nest. And then what happens is a lot of people go to braid to fluorocarbon setup on a spinning outfit, which is a terrible thing to do, guys. It's probably the biggest myth in bass fishing that I see is the need to use braid to fluorocarbon. There's so many advantages of using straight fluorocarbon over braid to fluorocarbon. I've done a ton of videos on that. You can, refer back to some of those. But using straight fluorocarbon has a tremendous amount of advantages to the bass angler if you put it on correctly. Now, another thing about fluorocarbon line, let's talk a little bit about how often you need to re-spool it. A couple different things that will determine how much you need to re-spool. A lot of it has to do with how much fray you're getting or if you get a bird's nest. Here's one of the sort of a reality and a drawback a little bit of fluorocarbon that you have to remember. If you get a really bad bird's nest on fluorocarbon line, whether it be on a spinning outfit or a bait caster, the property of a fluorocarbon line it'll weaken that line. So if say for example, if you throw out there and you get a bird's nest, when you're picking that bird's nest out, if you're able to pick it out, make sure that you pick it out past where the bird's nest was, because anytime the line is crimped or kinked from that bird's nest, it's going to weaken that line and you will break your line for sure. So if you get one of those really deep bird's nest out there that goes deep into the reel, my advice is to re-spool the whole reel. It's going to weaken it tremendously if you don't do that. The same on a spinning reel. Another thing about that I have found out that gives me a lot more advantage is, unless I'm using really light line like 6 or 8 or 10 pound test line, I spool all fluorocarbon. I don't use any backing on it. And the advantage of not using any backing is if you are out there fishing and you don't have any spare line with you and you get a fluff or a bird's nest, you can pick it out past that bird's nest and still have enough line to continue fishing with that. The longevity of it, as long as your line is not sitting out in bright sunlight, it's going to last for years on your reel. Another thing you can do to help out a little bit as far as if you want to get the maximum life out of fluorocarbon is, say for example, you haven't been fishing for 6 or 8 months, you got fluorocarbon line on your reels. Simply put a lure on, hook it up to your bumper or your truck or a tree or something, and come back and stretch it. Just don't stretch it to the point where it's going to break, but just stretch it. And that's going to, really take any type of, memory out of that. It's a good way to handle it with that. But the main thing, guys, is just you want to use fluorocarbon lines exclusively in a couple different situations. Anytime that you're fishing a slow bait, like a shaky head, a Ned rig, a plastic worm, a jig, a football head jig, anything where the bait is on the bottom, this is the time when the line is the most highly visible, especially in clear water. So this is when fluorocarbon line excels. When fluorocarbon line first came out, a lot of guys that were masters like at fishing finesse jigs and finesse techniques, they started dominating simply because they could use lighter line. It was invisible. They got a lot more bites than they ever did on monofilament line. So that's a big factor with that. So anyway, guys, it's one of my favorite lines. Like I said, this is the one that I use right here at Seaguar and Vizex. I'll link this in the description of my video and my Tackle Warehouse link if you guys want to pick some up. The cool thing about the Seaguar and Vizex is it's low diameter, it's super abrasion resistant, it's supple. This is the only fluorocarbon line that I use. So Seaguar makes a lot of different types, but the Vizex is what I use 100% of the time. But you can't really get away with it. Unless you just don't want to spend any money on fishing and it's not that big of a deal to you, fluorocarbon line is a necessity. In addition to fishing the slow baits, like the bottom baits like that, another key element for a fluorocarbon line is allowing baits to get deeper, like we talked about earlier. So anytime I'm using a crankbait, a jerk bait, anything like that actually has a lip on it that goes down, I'm always using fluorocarbon line because I can use a smaller diameter line, which gives me more action on the lure and still allows the bait to get deeper, and I don't have the stretch to it near as much. But guys, the only time that I don't use fluorocarbon line is if, say for example, I'm fishing a frog or a horny toad over thick matted vegetation, or if I'm pitching thick mats, I'll use braided line. And then if I'm using a topwater bait like a chugger or a walking topwater, I do use monofilament because fluorocarbon will sink the nose of your topwater. But other than that, guys, I got fluorocarbon line on, during the course of the year, I probably have fluorocarbon line tied on over 95% of the time. The only 5% of the time that I don't are those situations that I just mentioned there. But anyway, guys, I'd highly suggest pick up a spool of Seaguar and Vizex, Tackle Warehouse link in the description. And it's just one of the it's one of the easiest, simplest ways that I think that you can get more bites, you become more efficient, and simply land more fish than you did with other type of lines. So anyway, I hope it helps out. We'll talk later.